Morning guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. A fascinating first day of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix weekend. McLaren absolutely nowhere today in FP2 after both having their moments with the wall. Lando Norris certainly harder than most, ending his session earlier than he would have wanted despite a good start to the day, but their race pace according to the simulation data really nowhere to be seen. The Ferraris on top in both categories. Hamilton extremely happy with the way that his day progressed. What does that mean for a potential famous Ferrari win this weekend? Or are McLaren sandbagging all along? Maybe Red Bull could be a serious threat as well. Very much intro to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Plenty to get into. We're going to begin with a couple of funny things. Starting here, Helmut Marko talks about Yuki. We know that this weekend and every weekend now is very important for Tsunoda. He says since his promotion, Makis has been very busy in all areas. He hasn't yet had time to work with Yuki in detail, saying again that Yuki did not have the same floor upgrade that Max had back in Monza. This weekend, I think, should be a closer comparison. Leclerc over the last few years, 2018, 6th, 2019, 5th, follow on from there, excluding the engine-related DNF in 2022. And maybe this year is finally the year, although, you know, maybe we've jinxed it by talking about that. It's definitely possible. Max was also talking about his intention to stay with Red Bull for the longer term. Wow, Max says that he wants to retire with Red Bull. Shock, right? Like, drivers tend to do this for the teams that they drive for. But still, he definitely seems a happier man now than he did when Christian Horner was around a couple of months ago. They've even confirmed, I think, today, Helmut Marko, that next year he will be looking to race in the 24 Hours of Nürburgring. And I think Max has even pretty much said that to himself. So that is going to happen. It's going to keep him happier, I imagine, as well with the current state of F1. A few upgrades, it's got to be said, on the day as well. Nothing incredibly dramatic, of course, but just a couple of notable changes on the front wings at Mercedes. This is what they ran back in Zandvoort. This is what they ran in Monza. And now this is the version they've got in Azerbaijan. So again, the top element here has been changed to a certain extent. Look, is it going to be a complete difference maker? Probably not, let's be honest. But the Ferrari have done something kind of interesting. We know that there's been lots of talk this season, and for good reason, about brake cooling, about the ability of the McLaren to keep their rear tyres warm, the brake duct, and all this type of stuff. And we understand that for some time, frankly, before we started talking about it publicly, the teams knew this was happening, and they have for a long time now been preparing some of their own solutions. This is what Ferrari are cooking up. They've actually made a modification for their brake cooling. So the internal ducts remain unchanged, the same inlet, with a larger outlet section. So they're trying a few ideas to effectively reduce, I imagine, the amount of lift and coast required on the cars, and hopefully get the brakes into a better spot, because Hamilton hasn't been especially happy with the brake performance on this year's Ferrari, and for various reasons. Today, apparently in FP1, what's relevant about this is in the first practice session, Hamilton was like, we had issues with the brakes, but in the second practice session, they resolved it, and he was really happy with the progress. So this might be something, a very small change, but it might be something that Ferrari have discovered that really helps them turn a bit of a corner this season, and all of this will be good news to Oscar Piastri, right? Because if his championship lead is 31 points, that all of a sudden looks a lot more compelling when Red Bull are better, when Ferrari are better, when there's a lower chance that Lando can just go win, 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 and therefore cut into his gap dramatically with the 7-point swing. A 3-point swing is far less of a big deal on a race-by-race weekend. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but it was this funny story today that some of the technology that the drivers are wearing is maybe compromised. So they've been using these headbands, and the drivers use these, and the understanding is that the Chinese companies that either make these or have access to them may have been able to access the brain data of Charles Leclerc and other elite athletes. So it seems like he wears, he wears these Focus Calm headbands, and apparently the data is potentially accessible by the Chinese military. So whether they're using Leclerc's brain power to, I don't know, do some sort of analysis, I just thought it was a funny story that emerged today, but not massively relevant for our discussion. I also feel a little bit bad because yesterday George Russell, they said, oh, he's unwell. he's not going to be able to attend media day. And usually when a driver is unwell for media day, they are unwell, but they typically turn up on the Friday and really they're perfectly fine. And I was kind of saying, oh, typical, isn't it, George, taking the media day off when there's going to be lots of pressure about why haven't you got a new contract and all this stuff. Now, obviously, he was unwell. I wasn't pretending that he wasn't unwell. But he actually is quite unwell, the poor guy. Like, his radio messages today, the guy could barely speak, and it was strange because his trainer yesterday was like, oh, George is okay, he'll be back tomorrow, no big deal. But this is like, I've not heard a driver sound this unwell on the radio in a long time. And even after today, after FP1, FP2, and he drove well today. Imagine if he was, really well, what he could do potentially in that Mercedes this weekend. But after practice was over, instead of going to the driver's briefing, he just went back to his hotel room and went to bed. That's, I think, according to his own trainer and his own team. So, yeah, hope George is feeling better tomorrow, because if you're not really at 100%, it is a difficult track here in Baku, right? There are lots of walls and they close in on you very swiftly indeed. Bit of drama during FP1. I mean, a couple of bits of drama, really. Hadjar was having a go at Carlos Sainz. That should come as no surprise when it comes to impeding. If someone's complaining about impeding, it is usually Sainz who's done it. And it was just funny because I saw a tweet. I wasn't watching FP1 live. I saw a tweet with this quote from Hadjar. I don't know what he's doing. He's just so annoying. It's on purpose all the time. He says this. But I was like, he's talking about Sainz, isn't he? And I think that was indeed the case. The big drama, though, really was Piastri. He had this engine issue, which was hilarious today in multiple ways. Because after Monza, all the talk was, well, Oscar, Lando's had a slow pit stop, so we're going to make yours slower instead. So we're going to tell the front jack man to wait 3 seconds so we can give you the same slow stop. Oh, sorry, Oscar. Lando's car's blown up back in Zandvoort. We're going to need to do the same with you, right? So there's all this discussion about it, and it was just pretty funny how after what's happened there, Piastri's car also gives up the ghost, but due to all the red flags and the yellow, green, and all this stuff that was happening, so Sainz went over the curb basically at the final corner. It's not technically the final corner, but the last sector has one proper corner and then it's just flat out, as we know, for the rest of the lap. Now, Sainz went over that corner, he over the curb, caused a few issues and actually just dragged something up from underneath the curb. They had to resolve that. And while they were doing that, there were loads of issues with the, the curbing. The session was going green, yellow all the time. Now, Sainz, for some reason here, and I don't understand exactly why, he just drove into the Alpine pit box. I don't know if he explained this afterwards, but look at the guys. They're just so confused. They're like, hang on a second, this is a Williams. And yeah, a few years ago, Sainz did drive for Renault, right? So maybe he just wanted to say hello. But it's a pretty rare mistake to make. We see this on occasion with former teams if they were driving for them last year or something. But for Sainz to go to the Alpine box was very surprising, I thought. But anyway, while all this drama was happening, Piastri's engine got fixed and he got out there without too much difficulty and didn't lose an awful lot of running. So that will be, he'll be relatively happy about that. Now, Hamilton's day didn't start especially well. He clipped the wall, got a puncture. There were so many drivers clipping the wall today. Verstappen, he had a big lockup actually going into what is one of the trickiest corners on the entire calendar, because the way this corner on the right-hand side cambers, you have to go left, then right, then brake. It's such a tricky corner. We saw multiple drivers hitting the exit wall here. This time, Max couldn't even make the corner, so he locked up and took to the runoff area, as some other drivers have famously done in the past. And he wasn't very happy about the way that the car was behaving there. We know that Max historically doesn't have a great, not record here exactly, but, well, I mean, that is also true. But he doesn't have a great relationship with Baku, let's just put it that way. So he was not having as much fun today, Max, as he was, let's say, back in Monza. There was also this, I don't know what the Williams is made of, but the right or the left wing mirror just flew off again. Like, okay, the actual wing mirror didn't fly off, but the mirror in the wing mirror flew off. So I don't know what they're doing at Williams. The amount of times we see this, the Williams just breaks for no reason. I don't know what they're building it from, but it is clearly an issue. We know that they're focused on next year, but, we've seen these wing mirrors just fly off before. This time it was the mirror itself that flew out of there. Definitely going to fail your MOT with that. This was Oscar Piastri hitting the wall at that corner, and this was the time that he did it in the first free practice session, but he actually did it again later in the day as well. But by the time the session came to an end, it was the familiar suspects at the top. Lando P1, Oscar P2, Charles Leclerc P3. This, I mean, if you had to predict FP1, you would probably have predicted this, to be honest, and that's what it turned out to be. And there was a feeling of, oh, here we go again, you know, like Hamilton was struggling, he was down in 13th, Charles Leclerc was 3rd, Norris, Piastri separated by 3/10, Norris did a 1:42.7, and just keep that time in mind, because certainly later in the day, those times got an awful lot faster, as we shall get into. Now, just a quick stat for you all, if you're a Lando fan, look away now, top FP1 equals no win. In the last pretty much decade of racing around this circuit, the previous 8 iterations of this Grand Prix, the driver who's topped the first free practice session has failed to win the Grand Prix. The last 4 years in a row, it's been a Red Bull driver, and on none of that is pretty remarkable, right? Because Perez won a couple of times around here, but not when he topped FP1 in 2022, and Max has done it a few times, even 2017, and won on none of those occasions, right? So, pretty crazy. Norris topped FP1 this time. Is there anything in that? I guess time will tell through the weekend. Free practice 2, though, was in many ways more interesting because there was the whole Norris drama that we'll get to in a second, but also we actually got some simulation data. Like, we've got some race simulation data here. Not great simulation data, but probably enough to look at. This is Charles Leclerc. I mean, you can see like that wheel is, if it's not touching the wall, I mean, it did touch the wall, right? The drivers were kissing the walls all over the place around this circuit today. We did also note a couple of alterations to what Ferrari are cooking up on their rear wing. Hamilton was running a slightly more loaded rear wing. Leclerc had this slightly less loaded rear wing, so we'll see what they choose, we'll see what they go for. Obviously, both of these you can see here on Hamilton's car, but this is what Leclerc was using at the top and Hamilton at the bottom. It did seem to work pretty well for Hamilton. How that will look in race trim is a question, but if your quali pace is still good enough with a higher downforce rear wing, it probably makes sense to keep it because it should give you some advantage in the race. But due to tyre degradation and stuff, like limiting the tyre wear. But then again, if you don't have as much downforce, you would be challenging to overtake in a straight line. And we saw what happened with last year's Mini DRS McLaren. They gave them an extra 3 kph, and that was critical to keeping Charles Leclerc behind from Oscar Piastri's perspective last year. So there are a few things that they were playing around with. But then we had this big moment, which was Lando Norris at the end of the first sector, into the wall and hard. I mean, that is a big hit. And as soon as I saw this, I was like, wow, okay, that is going to be damage. And indeed it was. He was absolutely limping around the track. And there were some questions as to whether this was driving in an unsafe condition. Could there have been some sort of repercussion? Should he have had to pull over to the side? But he could drive it back, and I don't think it was the end of the world, really. But this was a big hit, right? And, you know, halfway through the practice session, Hamilton at this point was top on a set of mediums, and this is kind of important to know. Many of the teams are saving right now lots of their medium tyres. A lot of the teams, even Ferrari included, they did plenty of running today on the softs, not as much on the mediums, because that medium is going to be a crucial tyre. It may become the best tyre in qualifying tomorrow. Pretty much every single race weekends that we've gone to so far, where they've had the C6, the C5, the C4, the C5 has been just as good of a qualifying tyre, if not better. And I'm not going to lie, around a lap that's 1 minute 40 seconds long, it's possible those C6s are just not the same tyre in the final couple of corners as they would like to be. So the medium is absolutely a viable qualifying tyre. And in terms of pure quali pace, they're probably quite similar. But in the race, obviously, you'd much prefer the medium, right? Because it's not going to disappear anywhere near as quickly. So Lando come out afterwards and says, look, obviously I'm not happy about it. I'm going to have to make up for it because that did cost him a fair chunk of running, which, yeah, he topped the first practice session. I think he'll be fine. But still not an ideal day for the McLarens by any means. And then the hilarious thing is, people were tweeting out, of course, the jokes really do write themselves. McLaren pit wall to Oscar, Lando's in the wall, please crash the car as well. And guess what happens just like a few minutes later? Oscar was back in the wall. He got away with this one. This time he clipped it with the front right, and it was a pretty decently sized impact. But he did get away with it. The car was fine, and he got on to complete the session. But yeah, you couldn't make some of this stuff up, really. Lando crashes a couple of minutes later. It happens near enough to Oscar as well, but not ideal for Norris given his prep for the weekends. especially because he didn't have a good qualifying here last year, as we know. It was obviously unfortunate with the yellow flag and everything, but still, right, Lando will be hoping for a better return because last year Oscar won around this circuit. Hamilton then on the soft tyres puts in a 141.2, and last year's pole position was a 141.3. So already the Ferrari, and Hamilton was asking the question on the radio compared to rivals, okay, where am I gaining, where am I losing? And Leclerc was gaining a bit on the straights, Hamilton was gaining a bit in the corners, and seemingly enough to offset, right? Hamilton was a bit quicker with that slightly higher downforce rear wing they had. But then Hamilton was asking, okay, where am I compared to my rivals on the long run data? And his engineer was telling him, damn, we're like half a second up. This is absolutely unknown territory. This was the quote that I was referring to. Adami on the radio says, damn, we're half a second quicker than Max. we're cooking right now. So the session concludes, and it is a Ferrari 1-2 by quite a considerable margin, right? A 141.2 for Hamilton, a 141.3 for Charles Leclerc. Then the two Mercedes, right? Russell half a second down. You know, you've got to think he's got at least another couple of tenths in there with the illness, right? And Antonelli doing a respectable job as well. Again, the lap count on the right is also relevant here because Norris only got 7 laps in, but still did, in that period, a faster lap than Piastri managed. So Piastri, again, the focus for McLaren probably is going to be more quali pace in tomorrow's session in FP3. But what's going on at McLaren, right? Are they sandbagging? Is something happening? Because their long-run data was also not massively impressive. Max was okay. He was in a decent spot. The Haas was looking pretty good. The rest of the cars kind of all over the place. Not really a massive surprise to see the Alpines struggling a bit, and also true for the Aston Martins. They're good at the higher downforce tracks, not so much of the low downforce ones. So, but that was a big FP2, right? Like for Hamilton to come back after a difficult FP1 to top the timesheet ahead of Charles Leclerc, who we know will always maximize everything around this particular circuit. That was competitive from Ferrari, and maybe there is something in the idea that Baku is one of the real two tracks, Baku and possibly Singapore, where there is a decent chance that Ferrari can actually gain a race win this season based on their car's strengths and weaknesses. There was a bit of drama. This is Oscar Piastri into his favourite corner. Famously, he made that crazy overtake last year. Now, there's a car there in the runoff area, and obviously you can't really see everything on this screen because the quality isn't great. But on the right-hand side, around about here, there is a yellow flashing here because there's a car off in the runoff area. But Oscar either ignores it or doesn't care or just realises that he's out of my way, so he sends it in anyway. And this was noted for failing to slow under yellow flags. Piastri was under investigation. There was talk about whether they were going to do something about this, because even in practice, if you fail to slow under yellows, you can get penalties for that. But it turned out that they've let him go. They've given him a driving reprimand and saying the yellow flag was displayed and the green light was shown at light panel 3. Drivers had been instructed if they see a green light, they must take the action required under a yellow flag condition, even though they've not been shown the yellow flag. And they then withdrew the yellow flag less than 1 second after. So whatever it was, they were like, technically a breach of regulations has occurred, but they were mitigating circumstances. So they've given him a reprimand consistent with similar incidents. So yeah, Oscar got away with that one. But let's have a look at some of the race pace, right? Because Leclerc on the soft was doing a 141 or 146.1. Hamilton on the medium doing a 146.2, right? So basically the same pace, which wouldn't be a massive surprise on those tyres. Verstappen, pretty much 3 to 4 to 5 tenths behind. He was the third fastest at this point, and he was quite a way back. Now, obviously, we've got no data for Norris because, unfortunately, he binned his car. Leclerc only did about 3 laps, but his pace, 146.2, 146.2 for Hamilton. Piastri was, on average, a 146.9. He actually started with a 145.7 and then quite quickly was into the 147s, whereas Hamilton and Leclerc, yeah, they did 3 laps, but they held exactly the same lap time, which usually goes to show that the cars work in pretty well. If there's big variations in lap time, it tends to show that the car's at least a bit of a handful. So that was interesting. Max 146.5, Yuki 146.9. So definitely, okay, it's still 3.5 tenths off Max, but Tsunoda will be happier with that. The Mercedes were doing 147s, and then the Williams even were kind of in the mix too. Albon was doing some laps on the hards and did a 146.5. You don't know fuel loads. We know that Williams often push it when it comes to that stuff anyway. But the point is, the Ferraris were not just the fastest in quali trim, but they were the fastest full stop today. Now look, will they be half a second a lap faster than the McLarens? No, right? So obviously that's not going to continue, and the McLarens were faster in the first session for sure. But there's no doubt that Ferrari made some big progress, and maybe this could be a weekend where they will at least give themselves a chance. Hamilton says, FP1 was a bit of a mess. I had some issues with the brakes. We made some changes going into FP2. The brakes were finally working perfectly, which again could be relevant to what we talked about at the start of the video with those upgrades they've made, or like just a small tweak they've made on the front brakes. And he says, look, I was able to make some really quick and big advantages in terms of just gaining time, pushing back my braking distance further and stuff like this. So yeah, Hamilton pretty ecstatic about his day overall. Some interesting reaction elsewhere as well. Verstappen says the car felt pretty good, stable balance. We've got to fine tune a bit. The long run felt okay. Usually when Max says that it feels okay, that's a pretty good sign for Red Bull, right? Because if the car is not great, Max will tell you it's not great. But if the car is fantastic, he won't usually say it was fantastic. He'll usually say, yeah, it's fine, and then he'll stick it on pole. So I wouldn't count Max out tomorrow at all either. Yuki was even not too disappointed as well, given he's now got, I think, the additional upgrades. As he says, like, it seems to be working. We're putting some things together. And to be 3.5 tenths off Max in terms of long run pace around a long track like Baku, you know, that's not too bad going. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.